So, in the early years of the 20th century, coming out of the realist fad, I don't know if you could really call it a fad, the realist movement of the 19th century, there's a big and very famous, very well-known movement in Russian culture that we know as the Avant-Garde. I think most famous of this is the Constructivist Movement, which gave us such pieces like Maleevich's Black Square, which was, for a long time considered the first example of truly abstract art. At the same time, in architecture, you had people like L. Lifshitzy, who was like doing these like really crazy experiments with space called the Prune Rooms, and you also had Vladimir Tatlin, who built that very famous. He didn't actually get around to making the building itself, but he did the very famous model for the. It was like some kind of like gigantic monument building to like Russian Marxism or whatever. Really, really cool structural. Include a link to some kind of image. Like all across the visual arts, there's this big emphasis on abstraction, constructivism. This is known as the Russian Avant-Garde. Very famous, Maleevich's Black Square and like his abstract paintings from the period. They're in like MoMA. They're very popular and highly prized works of abstract art, even though these artists were trying to destroy the social institution of art as it existed, separate from the rest of society. Their works eventually became integrated into museums, especially Western museums. But then, this was all happening in the first decade, the second decade of the 20th century. But then, around the same time as Lenin died in the mid-20s, 1920s, and then getting into the period of Stalinization, you have this sudden movement, this sudden shift in style towards what we know as Socialist Realism, which is just so different. It's not abstract anymore. It is still it goes back more to the preceding generation of artists. I mean, there are artists working within critical realism of the 19th century, and who also worked in constructivism and then became socialist realists. There are artists like Goncharova who spanned this entire three generational shift. But in socialist realism under Stalinism especially, there's a lot of there's a big retreat away from abstract art and towards classical representation. You see that especially in architecture as well, which becomes just incredibly monumental and monolithic. Not monolithic in the modernist sense, but monolithic in the classical sense. If you see some of these buildings in Moscow, these, they look like traditional, maybe Neopalladian, classical styles of architecture, but they're just incredibly humongous. And then in cinema, I mean, I'm less familiar with the examples. I can't name any off the top of my head, but there's a bit, I think cinema probably reflects is the best example of what motivated this movement, which it shares the same basis as the constructivists of wanting to dissolve this autonomous boundary between the institution of art and the rest of society. Just like the constructivists wanted to destroy museums, so too the socialist realists wanted to destroy the separation of art and the rest of society, which is why you get, like printmaking is a huge, there's like a huge surge in printmaking as like a form in socialist realism, like a lot of architects working very hard, putting a lot of effort into building things like bus shelters, very famous, and like the metros, of course. All these kinds of like public pieces of art are an attempt to, like, even though Constructivism and early Russian avant-garde art looks so different from socialist realism, in fact, the two are motivated by the same spirit, the same desire to integrate art more fully into everyday life, and to, at the same time, like, this gets more into like the philosophical basis of realism, and especially socialist realism, but the idea was to use art to construct the society of the present, not of the future, not to dream of like some utopian future society, but rather like their idea was that they are living in utopia in that moment because they had attained communism allegedly. So like that is utopia, and the idea was to not like project onto the future their desire for like their vision of what they want utopia to look like, but rather to project onto the present how they wanted utopia to be, in that moment. So I think like there's this connective strand between the two movements, even though they look so different. They are motivated by the same interests of, integrating visual art into society more fully, and like building something in the present, building a presently existing vision for what a communist utopia would look like. Anyway, I'm actually working right now on a more like systematic presentation of these ideas. I've got some books here. This is a pretty famous book on Russian art, one of the very earliest that was ever written by a non-academic, I should know, and a female no less. And then I have this other collection taken out from the library. It's called Culture of the Stalin Period. Anyway, there's a great essay in here by Boris Groys. So I'm putting together a more systematic presentation on this same topic. I want to use images. Like obviously I'm talking about art here, so it'd be nice to use some images, and also direct quotations. Like a lot of the ideas that I just rattled off and like the history are taken from these two texts in particular. And school's out forever, so I wanted to try my hand at sharing in like public education and whatnot. So look for that in the future. If you actually want to see that, maybe leave a comment and let me know that that's of interest to somebody rather than just myself. But until then, I'll see you.